Okay, so first off, everyone who got a notification didn't read the whole thing, not judging, happens all the time, and thought maybe this was a brand new episode of this specific series and is now disappointed and mad at me. Sorry. If you'd like to ask me about that, stay tuned. If you'd like to watch something that's very similar to that, this specific episode of our series, This Movie Exists, very much that. Anyway, yeah, Transformers the movie. The 80s one is being re-released to theaters for a big 40th anniversary theatrical run this year. A release date still to be determined that they're calling the Apology Tour, as in we're sorry we killed Optimus Prime, and like most of the other original cast off in this cartoon movie back then, and it made you all sad as little kids, which is, okay, silly branding, but it's a silly movie, and it's mostly promoting a new run of Studio Series collectible figures and fan events, so whatever, it's fine, I'll probably go see it, sure. Cut to the chase, I figure this was as good a time as any to re-upload a new edit of the Transformers the Movie Really That Good video, because one, people tell me consistently that it's one of the episodes they really liked best, but it was also copyright claimed for music and footage a long time ago, so I'd really like there to be a version that people can click on that actually earns me some money, but unlike the Spider-Man 1 and 2 episode, it looked like I could actually do that edit without having to remake the entire episode from scratch. Guess we'll find out. And two, I've also been thinking I'd like to actually do some answer people's questions videos, because that's really good for engagement, and Lord knows I could use the traffic to keep the channel on the front page. But the thing is, I feel like a lot of what people would want to ask about is stuff from a few years ago or further, because, you know, nature of digital media messes with your perception of time by design, but also telling people to go leave comments on older videos and I'll just try to sort through the new ones feels like some janky bullshit. So instead, my thought process here is I got plenty of stuff that could use a reissue or a bounce back to the top anyway, so one idea is to do some more video remastering, repost those remasters, and tell you all, hey, ask me some questions in the comments on these remastered videos for the first, I don't know, week or two that they're up, and I'll answer some of them in a follow-up video. Probably, like, unless I win the lottery or get a better full-time job again. So call this the first experiment with doing that, and see how it goes. Look down at the dates where this is posted, where you'll also find a link to the original full uncut version of this episode in the video description, and you'll see the window of time for asking questions in the comments. You know, it'll probably be like 2 to 3 weeks, but if this upload gets blocked and I have to remake it, who knows, I'm flexible. Just look at the description, it'll tell you. It's an experiment. We'll see what happens. No, I will not answer questions about other videos, completely unrelated subjects, my personal life, other people's personal lives, professional work, you know, stuff that would be in an NDA, like, be grown-ups about it. Ask about the video. Ask about the subject of the video. Stuff that's in the video or related to the video. Keep it on topic, basically. If it's a stupid question, I'm not going to answer. I'm also just not going to answer every question even if they're good, but the stupid ones won't even be considered. And yeah, now on to the show. As ever, the best way to keep all of this going is to like and subscribe, hit the bell, sign up for the Patreon, or if that's not an option, you can now drop some coin directly into the Ko-fi links. Yeah, now let's do the thing till all are one. For the past several months, writers and thinkers on the subject of popular and commercial art have been preoccupied with the curious implications of what's called the Fearless Girl, a lost wax bronze statue by artist Kristen Visval installed on New York's Bowling Green one day prior to International Women's Day 2017. It depicts a young girl standing defiantly against an unseen force implied by permanently windblown hair and clothing, and was initially accompanied by a plaque, since removed and replaced, reading, "Know the power of women in leadership, she makes a difference." Immediately of note is that while the Fearless Girl installation itself does not include a specific depiction of what exactly she is standing unafraid of, the statue's placement offers at least one unmistakable contextual connotation. Fearless Girl is placed directly opposite and facing another unrelated bronze statue, the Charging Bull, which has occupied its own space on Bowling Green since 1989 and is widely viewed as a symbol of aggressive market capitalism, given its Wall Street location, the historical connotations of the term bull market, and its origin tied to the stock market crash of the late 1980s. In this context, the Fearless Girl installation was immediately interpreted by much of the popular culture to not simply be a generic feminist platitude, but a very specific statement of resistance toward the hypermasculine, retrograde, patriarchal American conservatism embodied by the elevation of explicitly anti-feminist candidate Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States. As such, it's become a fantastically popular tourist destination, particularly for politically minded women and girls flocking to pose and take pictures with what's become seen as a symbol of female empowerment, various permutations of the resistance to the Trump administration, and even to right-wing market capitalism itself. Funny story, though. Despite its general associations, Charging Bull is not actually a work of Wall Street corporate art. It was an independently built and installed piece by a guerrilla artist named Arturo Demodica that was initially hauled off for not having a permit back in the day, but restored by public demand and today largely allowed to stay, in part because while Demodica has continued to play it coy about what, if any, political message he was trying to send beyond a vague paean to the strength of the American people, Wall Street has come to view it as a symbolic celebration of the market. Fearless Girl, on the other hand, actually is a work of Wall Street corporate art. Specifically, it's a paid installation advertising State Street Global Advisors' Gender Diversity Index, a hedge fund that directs investments to companies that demonstrate strong gender diversity in senior leadership. In fact, she being referenced in the plaque, back when it was there in all caps, was because SHE happens to be the index symbol on the NASDAQ stock ticker. Really. This, as you might expect, has led many to decry Fearless Girl as being profoundly cynical, mostly because it is profoundly cynical. A Wall Street hedge fund, albeit one operating with a nominally positive, socially forward-looking goal, not only advertising itself via an installation that looks like an inspirational piece, but effectively co-opts an actual work of independent art, seemingly in order to imply a much more radical political stance than it's actually striking. On the other hand, there's been an equally powerful backlash to the Backlash, with many folks stepping up to declare that they don't particularly care what Fearless Girl was actually meant to advertise, or that she is an advertisement at all. Regardless of what they might think of State Street, these supporters have argued, the symbolism of a powerful young girl standing defiantly, bull or otherwise, is powerful and deeply meaningful to them at this moment in time, and that they oughtn't to be shamed for continuing to adopt the symbol as part of their own feminist, progressive, and/or resistance iconography. This, of course, is a veritable tornado of the eternal questions surrounding art, authorial intent, patronage, and/or commercial art. Should the intent behind a creative work affect our perception thereof, and to what degree? If a work stirs something in the soul of its audience, if an audience finds meaning and vitality in a work, if a work speaks to you and means something as filtered through your consideration of it, does it really matter where it came from or what the original point was? Can you appreciate Renaissance religious art without necessarily adhering to or supporting the Roman Catholicism that much of it was commissioned to promote? Can you enjoy Sweet Home Alabama even if you don't agree that Neil Young should have kept his damn mouth shut about saying that racism was bad? Can you find Mount Rushmore inspirational without buying into the idea of any of those four guys as secular saints? If there was a movie that entertained you, moved you, that you found visually striking, thematically interesting, that maybe even broke your heart once upon a time, would it matter ultimately if that movie turned out to be meant as nothing other than a commercial? If the sights and sounds that bore down deep into your mind did so precisely because they were the tools of advertising? If that moment that broke your heart and maybe even shaped your young emotional psyche only ever existed in the first place because a company wanted you to buy a new action figure, should that change what it meant to you or somehow take away from the cultural influence that is one of the deciding factors in the endurance and impact of any work of art? With those questions and more in mind, let's talk about Transformers the movie. Yes, really. Really. That's what we're doing. I committed to this, and we're following it through. Let's get this out of the way. Transformers the movie is not a good film by any reasonable stretch of the imagination. Its storyline is convoluted, its pacing is ridiculous, the production quality jerks back and forth between unique and awful, it's completely impenetrable on a narrative level unless you were already neck-deep in Transformers lore in 1986. You can really tell that half the more famous voiceover cast has either complete contempt for the material, no actual idea what they're meant to be saying, or both, and every frame of it, in particular all the parts that make it in any way memorable, is nakedly and shamelessly a commercial for a line of action figures. Nothing more, nothing less. So why did I want to spend a really that good episode on this?
What's that darn fool doing?
Well, two reasons. One, the Matrix episode was always going to take a lot out of me, and I wanted to schedule something after that I could be a little more casual and fun about. Two, well, here's the thing.
That's what we're gonna find out.
Yes, Transformers the movie was a toy commercial inasmuch as it was a movie spun off from a kids' TV show from the 1980s, and an overwhelming number of those were toy commercials, thanks to Reagan-era deregulation of children's media guidelines that had previously not allowed for that to take place. But, well, despite how it feels in hindsight, Transformers making the jump to a feature film, and even to movie theaters, was not an especially unique occurrence at the time. There were a bunch of these things. He-Man and She-Ra got a movie, the Care Bears got two of them, Brave Star got one, Rainbow Bright, the Pound Puppies, and the original My Little Pony all got them, hell, the GoBots got one, and it doubled as an origin story for the Rock Lords. It's okay if you don't remember the Rock Lords.
Living rock with skirts and lights, rising up to crash and fight. Rock Lord, powerful living rock. He's so separately new from Tonka.
And of course, the same people behind Transformers also did one for G.I. Joe. I'm not going to do an episode about that one. No, not even if you ask nicely. But while I'm sure plenty of people will tell me that one or more of those films were among their most cherished rewatches back in the day, the fact is that Transformers the movie is really the only film of that whole not inconsequential extended moment in children's animation history that's ever really talked about today in any detail. And not just talked about, held up as a full-blown cult classic, released in multiple special editions and referred to as a cultural touchstone for a whole generation's worth of fans, including many people who will enthusiastically admit that it's a junky, messy, dumb, cynically commercial hodgepodge of a thing, sincerely and earnestly love this movie. And the entire ethos of Really That Good is that if something is beloved, there must be something there worth actually exploring. Yes, in effect, there must be more than meets the eye. So, before we actually tuck into the basics, one quick thing. Traditionally, Really That Good commentary is divided up into 5 sections: Basics, Let's Dig Deeper, Impact, On the Other Hand, and Verdict. But for this one, I'm thinking we can forgo On the Other Hand. Like I said up front, unlike all of the previous films we've done here, what makes Transformers the movie interesting is that it's good, but also decidedly not good. And the reasons for that are pretty much right on the surface and don't need a whole section. The animation is spotty, the characters are one-dimensional, the plot is complete nonsense, the most interesting things that happen involve the only 3 characters who actually are compelling being taken off the board. The whole thing is just a series of new toy introduction vignettes, and the voice acting ranges from passable journeyman work to name actors who clearly have almost no understanding of what they're meant to be saying or why. And all of those flaws are grouped together under the main big umbrella that it's not really a movie. It's a commercial. A very long, very cynical, very, very silly commercial. But on the other hand, everything about it, like the TV series it's spun off of, is part of what makes it so damn bizarre that it can't help but at least be constantly original. Now, original doesn't necessarily mean good, but it does mean memorable and at least interesting. There are 1,000 average, dreary, nothing special bad movies no one will ever remember, but everyone who's seen them remembers Zardoz, Plan 9, and Jupiter Ascending. Take the Transformers themselves. Even as far back as the series, just the fact that our main characters are a bunch of robots whose alt modes dictate them all having unique, gangly, awkward-looking body shapes and designs ensures right off the bat that every damn frame is just jammed with visual information. The transforming itself allows for, if not outright demands, fast-paced, kinetic action scenes, since you can change gears from a hand-to-hand fight scene to a car chase to a gunfight to a dinosaur battle to whatever else is allowed by whoever's been written into the scene. And yes, the fact that they're robots meant that they were allowed to throttle each other much more explicitly than other kids' TV characters of the day. I mean, just look at this right here. I don't care if you think the rest of this movie sucks. That's awesome. Now, likewise, its surface-level virtues are similarly apparent. It's a fun, goofy sci-fi cartoon. The characters are colorful and memorable, it moves at a briskly entertaining clip, it's way too strange to be boring, it's packed with action, there's always something novel happening on screen, and the sheer scope of the thing is genuinely impressive. Yes, it still is what it is, but on an objective scale, it's not too far removed in quality from other early 1980s B-list animated features, like Star Chaser, The Rankin Bass Return of the King, Fire and Ice, The Elm-Chanted Forest. If the job is delivering a feature's worth of colorful, nominally engaging action within a compelling storyline, it does that. And here and there, it actually achieves moments that are singularly itself. Firstly, let's observe some of the more obvious stuff. As an action film, it's very well directed, particularly considering how little real-world reference there is for how any of this stuff is supposed to move and work, and the Transformers themselves are not exactly the most expression-friendly characters, to put it lightly. Director Nelson Shin leans really hard on the use of subtle and/or not-so-subtle lighting effects to keep everything in stark relief, specifically the color theory application of orange for the good guys and the happy places and purple for the Decepticons and the bad places like Unicron's interior. For a movie that's about 98% clunky, boxy robots blowing each other up with lasers, Transformers the movie is an oddly beautiful thing to look at from scene to scene. Yes, even if they maintain the franchise tradition of paying exactly zero attention to consistency in what scale anyone or anything is actually supposed to be from scene to scene. Speaking of beautiful, the film's MVP is unquestionably music composer Vince DiCola, whose mixed media and synth orchestrations really do belong up there with Vangelis' Blade Runner score and Wendy Carlo's work on Tron in the pantheon of great electronic science fiction movie scores. On the performance side, yes, it's too bad that the production prioritized celebrity guest voices over professional voice actors for a lot of the primary cast, but the legendary Susan Blue gives a solid turn as Arcee, the first major recurring female Transformer.
Stay close to me, Daniel!
And at least Act 1 is heavy enough on Optimus Prime, Megatron, and Starscream that Peter Cullen, Frank Welker, and Chris Latta got to remind everyone why they were 3 of the best to ever do the job. And yes, it's, well, yeah, the fact that Orson Welles, the Orson goddamn Welles, finished one of Hollywood's most iconoclastic careers that began with Citizen Kane as the voice of a talking planet in Transformers the movie, a role that he completed a mere 5 days before his death. I mean, if that wasn't something that had actually happened, no one would have believed it. And Unicron is nothing if not memorable.
I am Unicron. Nobody Everybody summons Megatron. Then it pleases me to be the first.
On that note, let's talk about the relative values of intent versus result. Firstly, if you haven't actually watched Transformers the movie straight through in a while, or if you're watching this without ever having seen it in the first place for some reason, let's revisit the broad strokes of the story, which, actually we should also probably start with the show, because the movie sort of assumes you already know this stuff. So, deep breath. There's an entirely mechanical planet called Cybertron way out in deep space populated by robots who can transform into vehicles called the Transformers. The nice ones are called Autobots, the bad ones are called Decepticons. They're fighting a civil war and the Decepticons are winning. A detachment of Autobot soldiers led by Optimus Prime escape on a spaceship pursued by the Decepticon leader Megatron and his henchmen. Both teams crash land on prehistoric Earth and go into robot hibernation only to be reawakened in the then present 1980s, where they conceal themselves by adapting their vehicle forms to resemble common cars, trucks, and planes of Earth, and then continue their war as robots in disguise, with the Autobots swearing to defend humanity from Megatron after befriending a human mechanic named Sparkplug Witwicky, really, and his teenage son Spike. That was the backstory and default of the entire first 2 seasons of the very, very popular animated series that preceded this film. Transformers the movie actually fast-forwards that timeline 20 years into then-future 2005, where human Transformer cooperation has propelled Earth to become a technologically advanced player in intergalactic affairs and the site of a huge joint Autobot-human military installation in which the now-adult Spike is a major military and political figure and has a teenage son named Daniel who pals around with a cocky screw-up Autobot named Hot Rod who sucks. The Decepticons, still in control of Cybertron, launch a major surprise attack during which a pretty solid majority of the Autobots introduced on the original cartoon are slaughtered, like full-on dead, but Optimus Prime turns the tide by engaging Megatron in hand-to-hand combat, but he sustains a mortal injury as well when trying to protect Hot Rod because, again, Hot Rod sucks.
I fear the wounds are fatal.
Basically, in Act 1, the main hero and villain beat each other to death, with Prime dying on an operating table and passing the Autobot matrix of leadership to his pal Ultra Magnus, while Megatron dies because his underling Starscream stages a coup on the way back to Cybertron and dumps all the wounded Decepticons out into space because Starscream is a dick and he rules. Meanwhile, while all the rest of this has been happening, there's a giant evil planet-eating space monster called Unicron that's actually a giant transformer in its own right that's been floating around eating planets, but it also wants to destroy that matrix of leadership thing because it's like it's kryptonite for reasons we won't learn in the actual movie. So it resurrects Megatron and the other Decepticons, gives him a new name and identity as Galvatron, and sends him off to Cybertron to intercept it. Then a bunch of other disconnected stuff happens that's mostly about introducing new planets full of new characters to become new toys, but narratively is all about putting Hot Rod, who still sucks, through the paces of the hero's journey because he's actually the one who's destined to take up the matrix of leadership, upgrade into Rodimus Prime, defeat Unicron, and lead the franchise in a new, more Star Wars-inspired direction for 2 or 3, sort of, more seasons worth of cartoons on television. So yeah, and did I mention all the dying?
We gotta get this launcher into place. I still function.
Prime, you can't die.
If you want to sum up exactly why Transformers the movie left a mark on the generation who saw it firsthand, this detail will do nicely. An animated kids movie spun off from a daytime cartoon series about toy robots opens with almost the whole main cast of original characters getting blown up, crippled, or killed, climaxing with the main character of the series, Generation X's answer to the Clayton Moore Lone Ranger, getting shot in the gut and dying on an operating table. I mean, if Avengers Infinity War opened with the whole damn cast except maybe Vision getting killed off and then introduced a whole new crew of characters, people would be pissed, but it'd almost certainly be called a bold, daring, possibly even insane creative choice. I mean, who does that? But the thing is, we know who did it, and we know exactly why. Hasbro was launching a big new wave of Transformers toys that were in many ways a significant departure from the original line, and they figured the best way to do this was to full tilt kill off the original characters. Hey kids, all your toys are dead. Maybe you need to buy some new ones. The level of cynicism and involved in that is almost impressive in its sheer shameless audacity, having successfully crafted a narrative and set of characters so successfully that a generation of children fell in love with a commercial the way prior generations had fallen for the likes of Winnie the Pooh and Peter Pan. They now opted to murder them in order to use that same emotional connection to drive sales of even more merchandise. And a lot of the coolness of Transformers the movie is rooted in that audacity. It's so much bigger, more bizarre, and more explosively violent because the Mark I fans were getting a little older and you needed to keep them hooked. There's always dozens of characters buzzing around, crashing into each other in big spectacular battles because you need to reinforce the idea that the proper way to play Transformers was to own a bunch of them. The genuinely spectacular techno-organic art design of the various new worlds and the creatures being encountered, seriously, look at some of these background paintings, is necessary to help roll out an even greater variety of toys. Even the big time jump and status quo overhaul from a terrestrial action series to epic space opera serves a purpose, to excuse the increasingly sci-fi design scheme of the new generation of vehicle modes coming out of Hasbro and Takara. Every creative decision on display as part of this gonzo flight of fancy absurdity in actuality has an easily discernible marketing purpose, right down to the curiously metal-heavy soundtrack. Because in 1986, hard-shredding hair metal and power ballads were what big-time real movies sounded like to a 7-year-old. With all the narrative posturing about friendship, destiny, and hero's journey self-improvement, it's a movie that works really hard to convince you that it's something like the untamed offspring of George Lucas and Walt Disney, when in actuality, it's much more of a Don Draper production. But, once again, funny thing about that. For all the effort, it's possible that the producers actually did too good of a job. So here's an interesting thing about the death of Optimus Prime as a generation-defining moment concept. It worked so well that it didn't work at all. The whole purpose behind killing off most of the original characters, including the main hero of the series, was, as mentioned, to kickstart a rush of new toy sales. But while stories of traumatized youngsters so profoundly moved by the on-screen events that they and their parents wound up inundating Hasbro with angry hate mail and other infuriated feedback are the stuff of industry legend at this point, it's been said that an emergency meeting was even called upon one exec hearing that at least one child had locked themselves in a bathroom and refused to come out. What they bear out is that Transformers was where the Reagan-era shell game of disguising commercials as cartoons played itself. Rodimus Prime did not supplant his predecessor in the collective psyche of young Transformers fans, even though the movie did spin a basically functional boy becomes a man hero's journey about him proving himself worthy and yada yada hot rod still sucks. The kids had accepted Optimus Prime not just as a marketing mascot, but a full-fledged part of their formative fictional canon. And even though by 1986 you couldn't actually buy a new Optimus Prime figure in most toy stores, they weren't buying into the substitution. Even though there was no generational older Transformers fanbase to help stoke the outrage, or a meaningfully available internet to drive the backlash en masse, the backlash that did occur was apparently so apparent to the franchise corporate masters that they ordered the series producers to write the character's return into the conclusion of the 4th season. In the end, Hasbro and Sunbow did such a good job in framing Transformers as something more than just a commercial that it had effectively ceased to work as a commercial on some fundamental level. It was more than that now. How'd that happen?
Never seen anything like this before.
Well, Transformers the movie is about as literal a translation of the series to film as you can get without simply following the G.I. Joe and He-Man route of doing a multi-part episode and releasing it theatrically. The movie is the show, but bigger, louder, better, or at least more elaborately animated, and features an eclectic hard rock soundtrack rather than the loop tracks familiar from the series. The series in turn looked like a moving version of the comic books, which in turn was a narrative version of the toy commercials. In other words, whatever it was that works about Transformers the movie must also have largely been whatever worked about Transformers in the first place, so it's worth looking briefly at how all that came together. The toy-based cartoon boom of the 1980s was overwhelmingly, depending on your point of view, either thanks to or the fault of then newly elected US President Ronald Wilson Reagan and his ultra-controversial agenda of economic deregulation, i.e. dismantling dozens of long-standing laws and government apparatuses designed to protect consumers and workers by keeping various industries in check. Now, I can already sense a lot of my fellow late-period Gen Xers out there tensing up and getting all defensive, and guys, just please stop. We need to come to terms with this. Yes, the same forces that directly created, fed, and fueled a lot of the pop culture ephemera that you grew up genuinely loving and being positively impacted by, and now exist as some of your happiest and most cherished memories, are also the forces that decimated the labor sector, impoverished urban neighborhoods, began an unprecedented transfer of wealth overwhelmingly to Wall Street, gave cops the go-ahead to crack down on the inner city, and generally created a lot of the societal toxicity that we are still stuck with today. Dear God, are we still stuck with it today?
Oh shit, what are we gonna do now?
That doesn't mean that you need to junk your nostalgia or hate your memories. Optimus Prime, Prince Adam, and Jem are fictional characters. It's not their fault that they came into being as byproducts of some political decision-making, but it does mean that we should be grown-ups and own it. Even if you don't think getting rid of laws that said a kids' TV show couldn't be a commercial disguised as a story was a particularly egregious sin on behalf of Reagan's Federal Trade Commission, it was part of an agenda that a lot of people have some real tangible problems with, and we should probably own that and be okay with the discussion. In any case, when the kids' TV can't just be a commercial rules went away, toy companies went to work, and a formula already pioneered in comics like Shogun Warriors and Micronauts and on TV by He-Man and G.I. Joe and that little movie Star Wars quickly took shape. Lines of similarly designed action figures broken up into teams of good guys and bad guys. Now, let's focus on that aspect because, spoiler, what I'm going to posit about why Transformers worked as a long-term mythos where other properties did not chiefly revolves around it. Why break them into teams in the first place? Why not just sell all the different characters so every kid could have a favorite that was central to their appreciation, or if the idea here is to create a semblance of conflict in order to present the illusion that there was some grand narrative worth recounting, why not just designate one good guy and sell a legion of potential enemies for them to fight? Short answer, well, the toy companies wanted you to be less creative. No, for real, think about it. Prior to this era, the popular conception of how kids were expected to play with toys was very much the Andy from Toy Story model. I have a collection of playthings mainly acquired as gifts and rewards over the years. I assign them roles and act out stories of my own imagination in each session. Because for decades, that's how the toy business worked. But then every other company saw what Kenner was able to do with Star Wars, i.e. selling kids the ability to recreate their favorite movie scenarios by selling them the characters, vehicles, and settings in pieces. Why settle for selling one Han Solo in the hope that kids will see them as a much-needed new friend or foe in their existing collection when you can instead lean into the already present sense that it'd be better to also take home Han Solo's official friends and foes and places where they interacted. The gambit then, behind the likes of Masters of the Universe, G.I. Joe, Thundercats, etc., was instead of paying for the license for a property like Star Wars, why not invent our own? With invent our own largely meaning starting from a somewhat generic foundation with a unique aesthetic or thematic hook and working outward from there. Transformers, however, came about its version of a quote-unquote narrative in a slightly different fashion from most of its contemporaries, one that I believe has a lot to do with why it connected much more profoundly than basically every other made-up toy line story had, at least until the Ninja Turtles came along. And it all originates with the fact that the Transformers were not created from the ground up by Hasbro in the same way that, say, Mattel had conjured up a universe for He-Man to be the master of. Instead, Hasbro executives had taken note of the wide popularity across several different toy lines in Japan of vehicles that could be transformed into humanoid-looking robots. Most of these weren't necessarily characters so much as they were vehicles that took on a human shape, in part because humanoid robots or mecha had become an early enduring staple of the anime genre, in part because audiences were assumed to be more forgiving of limited animation if the figure animated wasn't necessarily moving all that much because it was a machine, but Hasbro immediately saw the potential in the basic idea, created by investing the humanoid modes of the vehicle with individual names and personalities of their own, of a toy that was both an action figure and a vehicle. Two toys in one!
Transformers from Hasbro.
As such, Hasbro bought the US redistribution rights to a sampling of transforming vehicle-to-robot toys, mainly but not exclusively from Takara's Diaclone line, and brought on a crew of creators intimately familiar with thinking up kid-targeted pop mythology, chiefly famed Marvel Comics writer-editor Jim Shooter and equally famed DC writer and editor Dennis O'Neil, to come up with a backstory and scenario that would allow the robots to be characters in two rival factions, with longtime comic scribe Bob Budiansky drafted to flesh out the bulk of the character names and personalities once the whole Autobots, Decepticons, robots in disguise thing had been worked out. In other words, even though the goal was to arrange for something quite the opposite by the time they were in kids' hands, the Transformers mythology was created under the circumstances not too dissimilar from the way real kids really are more naturally inclined to create, toy stories of their own, by essentially handing a pile of assorted plastic robots to some creative people and saying, make up a story out of this. Small wonder, then, that it felt more authentic and connected more profoundly with its intended audience than most of its contemporaries. I'd posit that this confluence of events in the inception of the franchise is why both the franchise itself and Transformers the movie specifically have consistently and improbably felt so much better not only than what they needed to be, than what they had any right to be. There was, however cynical the operating pretense behind it, something real and organic about how these characters and their world took shape and came into being on a narrative level, and it's carried through into almost every subsequent iteration that actually cared to look at what made this nonsense work in the first place. Ahem.
I am directly below. Enemy screwed him.
That's why G1 fans today can still point to episodes like Web World, The Golden Lagoon, The God Gambit, Dweller in the Depths, and The Ultimate Doom, where hardworking genre writers like Donald F. Glut, Jerry Conway, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, and many others found room within the premise for solid sci-fi storytelling, and it's why Transformers the movie ultimately has so much room to cut loose. Whether they exist only to push new merch or not, just the ideas behind a giant sentient mechanical planetoid that eats other planets, a tribe of garbage Transformers living in a space junkyard, the Quintessons running some kind of morally inverted inverted court system, an ocean full of entirely mechanical life, and whatever kind of sense the interior of Unicron was supposed to make, are compelling on their face. Honestly, if the characters would just shut up and stop saying everyone's name and alignment so we know which toys to buy for a minute or two, some of these sequences would play out like something out of Jodorowsky. However, weird for the sake of weird can make a film memorable, but if it digs in and sticks to the psyche, there's probably something else at play beyond being compelling to look at and or listen to. Even its most ardent fans tend to remember Transformers the movie as a wild rush of techno-futuristic cosmic imagery and over-the-top synth-heavy metal tracks, and those stretches are indeed probably the moments where it achieves its most transcendent state. But to achieve the kind of cultural staying power this film has, logic dictates there had to be something more there on a fundamental narrative level, even if actually putting it there had been the furthest thing from the filmmaker's intention. There must be something else. Right? And so, having thoroughly deconstructed the ways Transformers the movie transcends or more bizarrely succeeds because of its decidedly cynical origins, we come to the essential question of the piece. Apart from the accidental audacity of its aesthetic and the odd confluence of factors that imbued action figure advertising copy with quasi-mythological grandeur, is there actually something to this thing that makes it stand out as a unique generational flashpoint, to say nothing of a unique and prominent landmark in its own franchise, even all these years after G1, Headmasters, Supergod Master Force, Transformers Victory, Transformers Zone, Beast Wars 2, Beast Wars Neo, Beast Machines, Transformers Armada, Transformers Energon, Transformers Animated, Prime, Rescue Bots, Transformers Go, Robots in Disguise, Combiner Wars. Look, there were a lot of Transformer cartoons after this, okay? In any case, I'd offer that the answer is yes. The fact of the matter is, even if you remove both the personal connection most of those who ever bothered to watch it had with the material and the entertaining in itself weirdness inherent to the core premise, there's a fairly decent basic story being told here. Even if you don't really know or care who Optimus Prime, Megatron, or any of the characters from the series are, or why it's supposed to be a seismic event when a bunch of them are killed off, most of us understand the basic outlines of a war narrative, mostly because it's the only thing our species has been telling and hearing stories about longer than sex.
This reminds me of the battle on Alpha 9. The Petro Rabbits were... Grimlock, get your noodle out of my face!
Me, Grimlock, love Cubs war stories.
You're living one now.
And if you opt to frame Transformers the movie as precisely that, as a war movie, it has a pretty damn compelling setup for one. Whereas in most battles, in most wars throughout history, it's the lower-ranked guys who do the dying, and the generals and officers who pick up the pieces and carry on after. What if there was suddenly a battle where the generals on both sides died, but the war was still on, leaving the younger and or lower-ranked soldiers scrambling to figure out what they're supposed to do next, and even what they're supposed to be fighting about? That's an instantly compelling setup, especially as the beginning of a story, rather than some kind of Act 3 complication. You could port it into just about any military setting you can think of, World War II, dynastic China, ancient Rome, Civil War, whatever, and you'd probably come out with an interesting result that not only ratchets up the notions of improvisation and uncertainty that form the tension in any on-the-ground conflict narrative, but also has at least the potential for leading the characters into important revelations about why they're fighting in the first place now that the chief architects of all that fighting are no longer around to actively work the levers of power. Bonus points if you were to, use the first day on the job aspect of the scenario to highlight the key differences between a resistance army organized around an ideal versus an imperialist army that fetishizes power of whoever happens to be in charge. Or, if you really wanted to drive that point home, put both of these newly destabilized sides on course to confront a much greater existential menace that threatens them all. That's good drama. Now granted, what will make it immediately less good is forcing all that drama to play out amongst one-dimensional stock characters who mainly exist as advertisements for themselves. But even there, the film opts to move in some interesting ways. One of the reasons why Hot Rod Rodimus Prime ends up being not a great character, either here or continuing back into the series, is that he's kind of a poochie, a character designed around appearing superficially young and cool. However, a side effect of that is that it leads to the film presenting him and other new characters like RC, Blur, Springer, and of course Daniel as not just a new generation, but specifically a younger generation of heroes, further reinforced by pairing them with the reflexively childlike Dinobots, and making the main adult in the adventure, Cup, symbolically a grandfather rather than a father figure. Transformers the movie, then, is effectively a film about youth carrying on, maybe before it was ready, in the aftermath of a major change to their team aka family dynamic.
This new menace is more dangerous than all the Decepticons put together.
And changes to family dynamics were something that many in the original generation of Transformers fans were absolutely facing as part of their everyday lives. The Reagan 80s may have been defined by a veneer of return to the stability of 1950s nuclear family ideal being projected by the media, but as the decade headed into the home stretch, it would become increasingly clear the social upheaval was indeed continuing whether the baby boomers had had their fill of it or not. And as enraged as young Transformers fans were at the character deaths, it's not hard to imagine a film that spends about 70 of its 90 minutes reinforcing an idea that you will in fact go on and even and thrive in the absence of once solid support systems, hitting home for a lot of them at the time and resonating even more profoundly as the film passed into the realm of memory, inevitably bringing the memories of how scenes like the death of Prime had affected them emotionally to the forefront while obscuring the clunkier, less effective greater whole. And to see this as they got older becoming a psychological reference point that they may not have realized they were drawing on half the time.
Maybe the Matrix can stop it.
You're right, it can.
What do you know about it, lad?
I just got this feeling.
Now, more broadly, the narrative journey that the main characters end up taking is literally all about questioning systems of authority and the decisions of the older generation and/or supposedly those in charge. Whether that was the conscious intent of the filmmakers, probably not, but who can say? What's on screen is on screen. The entire point of the Matrix of leadership as a plot device is that everyone's near-universal assumptions about who is and isn't supposed to inherit it turns out to be wrong. One of the earliest Autobot deaths is Prowl. You remember, he was a police car, so much for the security of law and order. The Quintesson's entire operation is a literal grotesque perversion of the idea of a system of justice, and their supposed authority over it is so tenuous, it can be outthought by Grimlock of all people. Dinosaurs, whatever.
Me Grimlock say execute them!
And even though the fans would have to wait until the series started back up to find out exactly where Unicron came from and what his purpose was, as is the case with Marvel's Galactus, it's hard not to notice that the Transformers are fighting a fairly unmistakable god figure, or at least the end of the world itself personified. Can't get much more authoritative than that. Intentionally or not, if there's an actual lesson that Transformers fans took away from the movie, it's that change and upheaval are not only inevitable and necessary, but a good unto themselves, something to be welcomed. Even in the absence of the character deaths, the fact is that the time jump and the move of the action away from Earth entirely fits in with this same overarching theme of enduring, well, for lack of a better word, transformation. The storyline blows up the status quo of the series, or if you limit scope to just the film, a tether to a recognizable version of Earthbound reality, shatters, if only for a while, the dividing line between the heroes and the villains, and sends the audience literally and figuratively hurtling off into an unknown universe. But it also says that that's okay, and that you'll get through it and maybe even come out better. A theme embodied by the way that one-time audience surrogate kid who's friends with the Transformers character Spike has grown up into a man without having to grow out of the Transformers themselves, which, as you know, is not the way children's stories that are metaphorically about our relationship to our childhood toys and imaginary friends are typically supposed to end, even as he shared and in fact passed on his special bond to his own son.
You did it!
Yeah, I did it!
But nah, no way embedding that theme directly into this key point in the mythos had even a little bit to do with Transformers being one of the only Reagan-era narrative toy tunes to truly become a generational franchise, right? Total coincidence, I'm sure. So what then do we make of Transformers the movie? Generational touchstone that deserves its place, lodged in the collective psyche of a certain age and demographic of devoted fan, or shameless cynical marketing ploy that's been mistaken as such by the virtue of how effectively its insidious use of emotional manipulation actually worked? Well, having now poured through its merits to a degree that even I never expected to, I feel like the answer is that, in much the same way the Transformers themselves are both cars and action figures, it's both. We can argue the degree to which a beloved childhood story that was actually a toy commercial is on the same level as, say, a beloved childhood story that was actually intended as a moralistic instruction, i.e. a commercial for the accepted social values of the day, but either way, the function that they serve once the narrative itself is passed from storyteller into the memory of the audience is about the same. Your reaction to a creative work, the emotion it stirs in you, the meaning you invest it with, etc., exist independent of the work itself and are valid in the sense that all feelings ultimately are. That said, there is a difference in sentiment between this thing is attached to a memory that makes me feel good and is in that sense good, and this thing made me feel good because it connected with me in a way that it was supposed to, and like it or not, commercial art always has a certain possibly unfair edge there because connecting with people is commercial art's entire job. What matters then is whether or not you think the work in question actually does something interesting and meaningful once that connection has been made, and I remain more convinced than ever that whether intentional or however slight, Transformers the movie does, and that if it hadn't, it wouldn't still have the very real following it has as an animated cult classic today, even if that following remains baffling to those who don't have a first-hand connection to it, and even some of us who do.
Ba weep grana, weep ninny bong.
This is a film that exists to sell toys, yes, and it does so by imbuing those toys with personality and grounding them in a narrative scenario to tug at the heartstrings and ramp up the adrenaline of a young audience. But the funny thing about telling a story, or painting a picture for that matter, good enough to sell something, is that you sometimes end up making something that's simply just good. And however it came into being, Transformers ends up telling a compelling story of upheaval, survival, and personal growth that, when combined with what is in all likelihood an impossible to replicate alchemy of bizarrely compelling visuals, music, performances, and characterization, realizations, themselves all perhaps varying degrees of sloppy, undercooked, or just plain odd in their own right, that add up to something truly unique and memorable. The question of whether or not a work of art exists beyond the intent of creation is ultimately just reframing a question of whether the story belongs to the storyteller or the audience it's being told to. But the overlooked hitch to that question is that once you've been told a story and it lives on within you, you become the storyteller yourself, even if the only thing you ever do with it is replay it in your own memory or incorporate it into your subconscious frame of reference, because stories that endure do so because they aren't just chronicles of specific narratives, but of the emotions and meanings that they inspire in those who receive, remember, and pass them on.
Don't you think we have better things to do now than tell old stories?
No! Tell story!
P.S. Since this came up as I was finishing up this script, this is why James Cameron is wrong about Wonder Woman. It doesn't really ultimately matter whether or not the way the character is presented lines up with his personal view of what constitutes empowering for women, or even this or that academic philosophical checklist of model quasi-feminist iconography. If, as seems to be the case, a vast number of women and girls received Wonder Woman as empowering for them, then it is. Because the only fair measure of whether or not a work of art is empowering or meaningful or moving or emotionally resonant in any way is by whether or not people have found meaning, or been moved, or felt it resonate with them emotionally. Thus, in my considered opinion, while Transformers the movie would probably have a certain amount of value as a minor landmark of near-abstract pop art judged strictly on its technical production merits, the reason we're still talking about it today is because there is something else in there. Whether the filmmakers and toy company executives may have intended it to be, whatever the rationale was behind this or that creative decision, the effect of those decisions add up and live on beyond the 90 or so minutes it takes to watch the film in the memories of the audience and the meaning they invest and take away from it. Eventually, Time and Tide strips away the authorial intent behind almost any piece of art and gradually supplants it with the meaning conferred by the audience. Yes, even art that was specifically calculated to sell you on a religion, on a country, on an investment firm, or on a truck that transforms into a robot. Time, shared cultural memory, and the audience have all spoken. And what they've said is that if you were awed and terrified by that first introduction of Unicron, if you were thrilled by the Battle of Autobot City, if the Quintessons still figure in your nightmares, if Hot Rod's at once overdue yet also impromptu journey into adulthood gives you inspiration in your own journeys, even though he sucks.
Out of the way, Hot Rod!
If you cried when Daniel cried, if you were glad to see the Dinobots somehow manage to survive, and yes, if the death of Optimus Prime is still one of the key points your mind returns to when contemplating feelings of mortality and loss, it's because there is something there. Something real, something genuine. And that's why, yes, it is not just your nostalgia talking, it is not just because you were a kid when you saw it, it is not just because you love the toys. Whatever else it was meant to be, Transformers the movie is really that good.
Till all are one!
Till all